The sound of a bullwhip cutting through the air isn't a crack, it's a scream. In 1874, inside the dusty walls of Fort Laramie, that scream silenced a mob of 300 angry souls. They didn't gasp because the victim was a hardened criminal or a horse thief. They gasped because the person bleeding into the dirt wasn't the dangerous mountain man tied to the post. It was Hattie, the girl the whole town laughed at, the girl they called too big to love. She took the blow meant for him. But what they didn't know was that by drawing her blood, they hadn't just hurt a woman. They had woken a beast, and his next move wouldn't just break bones, it would burn their corrupt little world to the ground. The Wyoming Territory didn't care about your feelings. It cared about survival, grit, and how fast you could draw iron. But in the settlement of Fort Laramie, civilization had crept in just enough to bring its cruelty with it. Hattie Miller knew that cruelty better than anyone. At 24 years old, Hattie was a formidable woman, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying a weight that the delicate society ladies of the fort found offensive. She worked the back room of her father's dry goods store, hauling sacks of flour that grown men struggled with, her apron permanently dusted white, her hands red and chapped. Careful there, heavy load coming through. The taunt came from Bo Sterling, the mayor's son, leaning against a hitching post with his sycophants. He didn't mean the flour sack. He meant her. Hattie kept her eyes on the boardwalk planks. She had learned long ago that silence was the only armor that didn't rust. If she spoke back, she was hysterical. If she cried, she was a pathetic. If she ignored them, she was a stupid. There was no winning, only enduring. "Leave her be, Bo," came the tired voice of Old Man Miller, Hattie's father, stepping out from the shop. He was a kind man, but weak, indebted to Mayor Sterling for the lease on the store. "Just having fun, Mr. Miller," Bo smirked, tipping his expensive felt hat, just wondering how many horses it takes to get Hattie to church on Sunday. The laughter that followed was a familiar soundtrack to Hattie's life. She hefted the 50-pound sack onto the wagon, the wood groaning slightly. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from exertion, but from the burning shame that lived under her skin. She was the obese girl of Fort Laramie, a spectacle, a joke, but the atmosphere in the fort changed the day the mountain man rode in. It was late October, and the wind was already carrying the bite of the coming winter. The stranger rode a massive roan gelding, an animal that looked half wild, much like its rider. The man was wrapped in buffalo furs and worn buckskins that looked like they had seen the other side of the Rockies. His beard was thick, streaked with early gray, and his eyes were the color of cold river stones. He didn't ride to the saloon. He rode straight to the blacksmith's, dismounted with a heavy thud, and pulled a long bundle from his saddle. Hattie was sweeping the boardwalk, trying to make herself invisible as usual, when he walked past. He was huge, not just tall but dense, like an old oak tree. People stepped out of his way instinctively. He smelled of pine resin, old leather, and dried blood. As he passed Hattie, Bo Sterling stepped out of the saloon, emboldened by midday whiskey. He bumped into the stranger on purpose, looking for a reaction to impress the barmaids. "Watch it, savage," Bo sneered. The mountain man stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, just his head. He looked at Bo, then his eyes slid to Hattie, who was clutching her broom, terrified of the violence brewing. For a second, the stranger's gaze lingered on Hattie. There was no mockery in it, no disgust. Just a flat, assessing look, like a wolf checking the wind. Then he looked back at Bo, said absolutely nothing, and kept walking. Bo, robbed of a confrontation, looked foolish. He turned his anger on the easiest target. He kicked the dirt near Hattie's feet, sending dust onto her clean apron. "What are you staring at, cow? Get back inside." Hattie hurried in, but her heart was hammering. For the first time in years, a man had looked at her and hadn't laughed. His name, she would learn later, Was Silas Thorne? No, that wasn't right. Everyone called him Thorne, but the ledger at the general store said Silas Kincaid. He was a trapper, a guide, a man who lived above the timberline, where the air was too thin for lies. He came into the store 2 days later. Hattie was alone, counting inventory. The bell chimed, and the light in the room seemed to dim as he filled the doorway. "Need supplies." His voice was gravel, unused to conversation. "Flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. .45, 70. Hattie nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she moved to the shelves. She felt clumsy, painfully aware of her size in the narrow aisles. She reached for a tin of coffee on a high shelf, her dress straining at the seams. "Let me," Silas grunted. He reached over her, his arm brushing her shoulder. He grabbed the tin effortlessly. "Thank you," she whispered, keeping her head down. "You carry too much," Silas said. Hattie flinched. "I know. I'm sorry." "Not the weight," Silas corrected, placing the tin on the counter. He looked her dead in the eye. "You carry their words. Drop them. They weigh more than the fat." Hattie froze. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. Before she could respond, the door banged open. It was Mayor Sterling, flanked by the sheriff and Bo. "That's him!" Bo shouted, pointing a manicured finger at Silas. "That's the one who robbed the payroll wagon." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the heavy colt on his hip, though Hattie saw his hand twitch, a reflex of survival. "You're making a mistake," Hattie said, her voice surprisingly steady. "He's been here for 10 minutes. "Shut up, Hattie," Mayor Sterling snapped. He was a rotund man with a face like a dried apple, wearing a suit that cost more than Hattie's father made in a year. "Sheriff, arrest this drifter. We found the empty strongbox near his camp by the creek." It was a setup. Even Hattie, with her limited knowledge of the criminal world, could smell the rot of it. The payroll wagon had been hit 3 hours ago. Silas had been seen shoeing his horse at the smithy then, but the Sterlings needed a culprit. The town was restless about the recent bandit attacks, and an outsider, a savage-looking mountain man, was the perfect scapegoat. "I didn't take your gold," Silas said calmly, "and if I did, you wouldn't be standing here breathing." The sheriff, a nervous man named Harshest Thorne, no relation, just a cruel irony of names, pulled his gun. "Hands up, Kincaid. Don't make this messy." Silas looked at Hattie. He saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. He calculated the odds. 3 men here, more outside. If he started shooting, Hattie would be in the crossfire. He slowly raised his hands. They pistol-whipped him anyway. Bo struck him across the temple with the butt of his revolver. Silas went down on one knee, blood trickling into his beard, but he didn't make a sound. They dragged him out into the street. News traveled fast in Fort Laramie. By the time they hauled Silas to the central square, a crowd had gathered. They were hungry for justice, or at least hungry for a show. The Sterlings had been skimming the town budget for years, and a public hanging or whipping was a great way to distract the populace from the empty treasury. "This man," Mayor Sterling bellowed, standing on a crate, "is a thief. He steals from honest men. He preys on our town." "He's innocent," Hattie shouted. She had followed them out, her apron stained with the dust of the floor where she'd knelt to pick up the dropped coffee tin. The crowd turned to look at her. Laughter rippled through them. "Go home, Hattie," a woman shouted. "Go eat a pie and hush up. He was at the smithy." Hattie pushed through the crowd, using her size to part the sea of bodies. "Ask the smith. He couldn't have done it." The blacksmith, a man named Gus, looked down at his boots. He owed the mayor money. He said nothing. "See?" Bo grinned. "No alibi. Tie him up." They dragged Silas to the whipping post, a thick timber buried deep in the earth, stained dark from years of use. They stripped him of his fur coat and his shirt. The crowd went silent for a moment. Silas's back was a map of violence. Scars from bear claws, knife fights, and previous hard living crisscrossed his skin. He was built of muscle and trauma, They lashed his wrists high. 20 lashes, the mayor announced, for theft and resisting arrest. Then we hold him for the circuit judge. Bo grabbed the whip. It was a drover's bullwhip, heavy braided leather, tipped with a popper that could crack a board in half. Bo was eager. He wanted to break the mountain man. He wanted to show the town he was tough. "Don't do this!" Hattie screamed, but 2 deputies held her back. Silas rested his forehead against the wood. He was breathing slow, preparing for the pain. He'd survived worse. He'd survived blizzards that froze elk in their tracks. He would survive this fop and his toy. Crack. The first lash struck. Silas's muscles seized, but he didn't cry out. A red welt bloomed instantly across his shoulder blades. Crack. The second. A grunt escaped him. Crack. The third cut skin. Blood began to run. Bo was enjoying it. He was putting his shoulder into it, laughing breathlessly. "Not so tough now, are you, bear man? Where's your growl?" By the 10th lash, Silas's knees were buckling. The pain was blinding, a white-hot fire consuming his nervous system. He was slipping into shock. Bo stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's barely conscious. Boring. Let's wake him up." He turned the whip around, holding the heavy wooden handle like a club. He aimed for the back of Silas's head. "No!" It happened in a blur. The deputies holding Hattie had relaxed, watching the show. Hattie Miller, fueled by a rage she didn't know she possessed, shoved them aside. She didn't run. She charged. She was big. She was heavy. And she had the momentum of a freight train. She threw herself between Bo and the bound, bleeding man. But Bo had already started his swing, not with the handle, but bringing the lash back around for a vicious, uncontrolled strike aimed at Silas's neck. Hattie turned her back to Bo to shield Silas, wrapping her large arms around the mountain man's waist, burying her face in his bloody side. The whip screamed. It didn't hit Silas. It wrapped around Hattie's back. The tip dug deep into the soft flesh of her shoulder and ripped downwards across her dress, shredding the fabric and the skin beneath. The sound was wet and heavy. Hattie didn't just scream. She shrieked, a sound of pure, agonizing shock that tore through the square. She collapsed, her weight dragging down on Silas's bound arms, her blood mingling with his. The crowd went instantly silent. Hitting a man, a drifter, was justice. Whipping a woman, even an outcast like Hattie, was a violation of the frontier code, so severe it stopped time. Bo stood there, the bloody whip trailing in the dust, his face draining of color. She got in the way. It's her fault. The fat cow got in the way." Silas Kincaid opened his eyes. The pain in his back was gone, replaced by a cold, dark void. He felt the warm blood of the woman on his legs. He heard her whimpering against the post. He lifted his head. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the rope binding his wrists. He pulled. It wasn't a human pull. It was the torque of an animal that realizes it is going to die if it doesn't escape. The hemp groaned. The wood of the post creaked. His biceps bulged, veins looking like they would burst. Snap! The rawhide strip holding his right wrist gave way. The sound of the leather snapping was louder than a gunshot in the silence. Silas freed his other hand. He didn't rub his wrists. He didn't check his wounds. He dropped to his knees and gently, surprisingly gently, placed a hand on Hattie's trembling shoulder. "Easy," he rumbled, his voice shaking with a fury that vibrated the ground. "Easy now." He stood up. He turned to face Bo Sterling. Bo dropped the whip. He took a step back. "Now look." "Kincaid, it was an accident." Silas took one step forward. The entire town of Fort Laramie held its breath. They expected him to roar. They expected him to tackle Bo. But Silas Kincaid did something much more terrifying. He picked up Hattie Miller in his arms. She was a heavy woman, mocked for her size her entire life, a burden to everyone. Silas lifted her as if she were made of feathers. He held her against his chest, her blood soaking his bare skin. He looked at the mayor. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at Bo. "You had your turn," Silas said. The volume was low, but it carried to the back of the crowd. Pray to your God, because I'm coming back, and when I do, I'm taking the whole fort with me." He turned and walked toward the doctor's house, carrying Hattie through the parted crowd. No one moved to stop him. No one dared. The mountain man had spoken, and the fort began to tremble. The town doctor, Amos Reed, was a man who preferred horses to people. Horses didn't lie, and they rarely complained. But when the mountain man kicked open his surgery door, carrying Hattie Miller like a broken doll, Reed didn't argue. He cleared his examination table with a sweep of his arm, sending jars and instruments clattering. "Put her down. Gently, man, gently." Silas laid her on the cold leather. Hattie was drifting in and out of consciousness, her face pale against her dark hair, beads of sweat standing out on her forehead. The back of her dress was a ruin of cheap cotton soaked in crimson. "I need to cut the dress off," Dr. Reed said, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for shears. "And I'm going to need whiskey. A lot of it. For her, and maybe for me." Silas didn't move to leave. He stood at the head of the table, a towering shadow in the dim lamplight. His own back was still raw, blood drying in streaks down to his denim breeches. But he seemed unaware of his own pain. "You shouldn't be here," Hattie mumbled, her eyes fluttering open. They were glassy with shock. "They'll come for you." "Let them come," Silas said. It was the first time he'd spoken since the square. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Dr. Reed began to cut away the fabric. When he peeled back the last layer over her shoulder blade, even the hardened doctor hissed in a breath. The whip had done terrible work. The leather had chewed deep into the muscle, a jagged, ugly valley across her skin. It would scar badly. It would ache in the cold for the rest of her life. "Hattie," Dr. Reed said softly, holding up a bottle of amber liquid. "Drink this. All of it." She choked it down, coughing as the fire burned her throat. Silas reached out a hand that could snap a wolf's neck, and gently wiped a drop of whiskey from her chin. The stitching was brutal. There was no ether in Fort Laramie, only whiskey and grit. Hattie bit down on a leather strap Dr. Reed gave her. She screamed into it, muffled, agonizing sounds that tore at the silence of the room. Every time she screamed, Silas flinched. The man who had taken 20 lashes without a sound looked like he was being torn apart by her pain. He took her hand in his. His hand completely engulfed hers. It was rough, calloused, a tool of survival, but his grip was an anchor. Hattie held on like a drowning woman. It took an hour. By the end, Hattie had passed out from the exhaustion of pain. Dr. Reed wiped his bloody hands on a rag, pouring himself 3 fingers of whiskey. He looked at Silas. "She'll live. She's built strong. Stronger than any of those porcelain dolls prancing around the boardwalk." Silas looked down at her sleeping face. The shame that usually clouded her features was gone, replaced by a slack peacefulness. "Why did she do it?" Silas asked. It was a genuine question. In his world, you looked out for yourself. Self-sacrifice was a quick way to die. "Because," Dr. Reed sighed, sitting heavily on a stool, "this town has spent 20 years telling Hattie Miller she is worthless space. Today she decided to prove them wrong by saving a man they deemed even more worthless." Reed took a drink. "And because she has a heart the size of the territory, and this town doesn't deserve her." Silas ran a thumb over Hattie's knuckles. "They hurt her to get to me. They hurt her because they enjoy it, Kincaid. Bo Sterling is a vicious little cur whose daddy owns the kennel. The mayor is skimming off the Union Pacific Railway contracts. They needed a show today to distract folks from the fact that the bank is nearly empty. You were just convenient." Silas's eyes narrowed. The cold grey stones turned almost black. They used her pain for a distraction. "That's about the size of it." Silas gently released Hattie's hand. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street of Fort Laramie. The saloons were starting to light up. Piano music drifted on the cold wind. It all looked so normal, so civilized. "Doctor," Silas said, not turning around, "keep her safe tonight. If anyone comes through that door that isn't me, you shoot them." Dr. Reed looked at the mountain man's silhouette. He saw the tension in the shoulders, the predatory tilt of the head. Reed opened a drawer and pulled out an old Navy Colt revolver. He placed it on the desk. "Where are you going?" Reed asked. Silas turned. The look on his face made the doctor shiver. It was the look of a man who had decided to stop being prey. "I need my rifle, and I need to go hunting." Silas Kincaid did not go back to the town square. He melted into the shadows between buildings, moving with a silence that defied his size. He retrieved his gear from where the sheriff's deputies had dumped it behind the jailhouse. They had taken his money and his knife, but they had foolishly left his Sharps buffalo rifle, deeming it too heavy and clumsy for a town fight. They were wrong. He rode his roan gelding out of town 5 miles to a hidden cache he maintained in a limestone cave. There, he dressed his own wounds with bear grease and pine tar, binding his ribs tight. He swapped his town clothes for his full winter gear, heavy furs, moccasins lined with wool, and a bandolier of massive .45, 70 cartridges. When he emerged from the cave, he wasn't just Silas Kincaid anymore. He was something ancient and primal. He was the thing the Cheyenne whispered about in the high passes. He was the blizzard given form. He knew he couldn't take the fort head-on. Sterling had 30 paid deputies and the town walls. Silas needed to bleed them first. He needed to take away their security, their money, and their arrogance. He knew exactly where to start. Mayor Sterling was corrupt, which meant he had secrets to protect. And his biggest secret was moving that night. According to the tracks Silas had seen earlier that week, and the hushed conversation he'd overheard at the smithy before his arrest, Sterling was shipping a load of stolen Union Pacific surveying equipment east to sell on the black market in Omaha. It was worth thousands. The shipment was moving through Chimney Rock Canyon tonight to avoid the main trail patrols. Silas rode hard, cutting across the open prairie under the light of a freezing moon. He reached the canyon 2 hours ahead of the wagon. The canyon was a narrow throat of red rock, shadowed and deadly. The wind howled through it like lost souls. Silas stood in the middle of the trail. He didn't hide. He began to gather wood. By the time the lead wagon lumbered around the bend, its lanterns swinging wildly in the wind, Silas had built a bonfire right in the center of the pass. The flames leaped 10 feet high, casting dancing, terrifying shadows against the canyon walls. The wagon convoy ground to a halt. There were 3 wagons and 6 outriders. Leading them, bundled in a sheepskin coat and looking miserable, was Bo Sterling. His father had sent him on this run to toughen him up after his embarrassing display with the whip. "What in hell is this?" Bo yelled over the wind, pulling his horse up. "Who's there? Move that fire!" A figure stepped out from behind the flames. Silas Kincaid stood bathed in firelight, looking 8 feet tall in his furs, holding the massive Sharps rifle casually across his chest. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, an undeniable obstruction. "It's the Bear Man," one of the guards whispered, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "Damn it, Kincaid!" Bo shouted. His voice cracking with fear he tried to hide with bluster. "Get out of the road! You're a wanted man! I've got 6 guns here." Silas slowly raised the Sharps. He didn't aim at Bo. He aimed past him, at the lead wagon driver. Boom! The roar of the buffalo gun was deafening in the confined space. The lead driver's hat flew off his head, punctuated by a clean hole through the crown. The man yelped and dove off the wagon seat, scrambling into the rocks. The horses screamed and reared. Chaos erupted. The guards pulled their pistols, firing wildly at the figure by the fire. Silas didn't move. The bullets kicked up dirt around him, one tugging at the fur of his coat. He calmly cracked the breech of the Sharps, ejected the smoking brass casing, and slid a new cartridge in. The metallic clack-clack of the reload was a sound of pure terror to the men facing him. "Next one takes a leg off," Silas called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind and the gunfire. "Leave the wagons! Walk away! Live!" The guards looked at Bo. They were hired guns, loyal only to money. They weren't paid enough to fight a ghost with a cannon. "Shoot him, you cowards!" Bo screamed. The guard closest to Bo spat on the ground, holstered his gun, and turned his horse around. "Ain't my fight, Sterling. Daddy didn't pay me to die in a canyon." One by one, the other 5 guards turned and rode back the way they came, leaving Bo alone with the 3 wagons full of stolen goods. Bo sat on his shivering horse, staring across the fire at the man he had whipped hours earlier. The bravado drained out of him, leaving only the spoiled, frightened child beneath. Silas walked around the fire, approaching Bo slowly. He grabbed the bridle of Bo's horse, jerking the animal still. He looked up at the mayor's son. Silas's eyes were utterly devoid of mercy. "Please," Bo whispered, his teeth chattering. "My father, he'll pay you." "Your father has nothing I want," Silas growled. He reached up and grabbed the front of Bo's expensive sheepskin coat, ripping him out of the saddle and throwing him onto the hard-packed dirt. Bo scrambled backward on his hands and feet. "You're going to kill me." "No," Silas said. He walked past Bo to the lead wagon. He pulled a burning brand from the bonfire and tossed it into the canvas covering of the wagon. The dry fabric caught instantly. Silas moved down the line, torching all 3 wagons. The surveying equipment, the brass theodolites, the expensive telescopes, the tripods, began to burn and melt. Thousands of dollars, the Sterling's safety net, went up in smoke. Silas walked back to where Bo was cowering in the dirt, illuminated by the inferno of his father's future. Silas crouched down so they were eye level. The smell of burning canvas and wood smoke filled the air. "You hurt her," Silas said, his voice like grinding stones. "You drew her blood because you were small, and you wanted to feel big. Do you feel big now, Bo?" Bo shook his head desperately, tears streaming down his freezing face. "Good," Silas stood up. "Go back to your father. Tell him the mountain man isn't gone. Tell him I'm just clearing the brush before I burn down the house. Tell him Hattie Miller sends her regards." Silas turned his back on the sobbing man and walked away into the darkness, leaving the Sterling's fortune burning bright against the Black Canyon walls. The war for Fort Laramie had begun. Snow came to Fort Laramie in the night. It fell thick and silent, blanketing the mud and the blood of the previous day in pristine white. But inside Dr. Reed's surgery, the air was hot and heavy, with the smell of laudanum and wood smoke. Hattie Miller lay on her stomach, her face turned toward the frosted window. The pain in her back was a dull, throbbing beast that woke with her every breath. But worse than the pain was the memory. She closed her eyes and saw the whip falling. She saw the disgust in Bo Sterling's eyes. She felt the crushing weight of her own body, the body the town ridiculed, pressing into the dirt. A shadow blocked the moonlight streaming through the window. Hattie flinched, gasping as her stitches pulled. The window sash slid up silently. Silas Kincaid climbed over the sill, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. He shut the window and turned to her. He looked different. The wildness in his eyes had settled into something harder, colder. He smelled of smoke, not wood smoke, but the acrid chemical smell of burning varnish and brass. "You're awake," he said softly, moving to the stove to warm his hands. "You shouldn't be here," Hattie whispered, her voice raspy. "The sheriff has men patrolling every street. They have orders to shoot on sight." "They're looking for a man on a horse," Silas said, unbuttoning his heavy coat. "They aren't looking for a shadow." He pulled a wooden chair to the side of her cot and sat down. The wood groaned under his massive frame. He looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that made Hattie want to pull the sheet up over her head. She felt exposed, hideous. A woman of her size, scarred and broken, lying before a man who looked like he was carved from granite. "Why did you come back?" she asked, tears stinging her eyes. "Why didn't you just ride for the mountains? You were free." Silas reached out. His hand hovered for a moment before resting gently on her hair. His fingers were rough, stained with soot, but his touch was incredibly light. "A man doesn't leave his debt unpaid," Silas said, "and he doesn't leave his shield behind." "I'm not a shield," Hattie said bitterly. "I'm just big. I'm just a fat girl who got in the way." Silas leaned forward. His face was inches from hers. The intensity of his gaze stopped her breath. "Listen to me, Hattie Miller. Up in the high country, the skinny wolves die first. The pine that is too thin snaps in the wind. You have weight. You have substance. That isn't a weakness. It is an anchor," he gestured to her bandages. "You took a blow that would have crippled a lesser woman. You absorbed it. You saved my life not by accident, but because you were strong enough to take the hit." Hattie stared at him. No one had ever spoken about her body as if it were a tool, a fortress. They only spoke of it as a failure. "I burned his wagons," Silas said, changing the subject, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "Sterling's shipment. It's ash in the canyon." Hattie's eyes widened. "He'll kill you. He'll burn the whole town to find you. Let him try. He's bleeding money now. He'll get desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." Silas stood up and moved to the small table where Dr. Reed kept his supplies. He picked up a bowl of broth the doctor had left. "You need to eat. You need to keep that strength." He fed her. It was an intimate, quiet act that defied the violence of their world. The mountain man, whose hands were trained to skin elk and load rifles, carefully spooned broth for the woman who had been the town's punching bag. For the next 2 days, Silas was a ghost. He slept in the doctor's root cellar during the day and vanished into the night. Meanwhile, the mayor's mansion was a scene of chaos. Bo Sterling had returned, sobbing and smelling of smoke, with the news of the destroyed shipment. Mayor Sterling, his face purple with rage, had smashed his own imported crystal decanter against the wall. "He's mocking us!" Sterling screamed, pacing his study. "A savage is dismantling my operation. And you," he pointed a trembling finger at the sheriff, "you can't even find him." "He's not human, Mr. Mayor," Sheriff Thorne stammered. "My boys are scared. They say he turns into a wolf. They say bullets pass through him." "Superstitious nonsense," Sterling roared. "If the town won't give him up, we squeeze the town. If the doctor is hiding him, we squeeze the doctor." Sterling walked to his desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a heavy bag of gold coins, the last of his reserves. "Send a rider to Cheyenne," Sterling hissed. "I want the regulators. I want the Pinkertons. I don't care who. Get me hired guns who don't believe in ghost stories, and bring me Hattie Miller." "Sir?" The sheriff blinked. "The girl? She's half dead." "She's his weakness," Sterling smiled, a cruel, thin stretching of his lips. "He came back for her. He burned my wagons for her. If we have the girl, the wolf will come to the trap." 3 days after the whipping, the atmosphere in Fort Laramie had shifted from curiosity to dread. The mayor had declared martial law. The saloons were closed at sundown. Curfews were enforced with rifle butts. Dr. Reed was exhausted. He had been tending to Hattie and trying to keep Silas's presence a secret, a task that was becoming impossible. "You have to go," Reed told Silas on the 3rd evening. "They're searching house to house. They'll be here by morning." Silas was cleaning his Sharps rifle, the smell of gun oil filling the small cellar. "If I leave, they take her." "If you stay, they kill you both," Reed argued. Before Silas could answer, the sound of shattering glass came from upstairs. Heavy boots stomped on the floorboards above their heads. "Search the place! Turn it over!" It was the sheriff's voice. Silas grabbed his rifle, his muscles coiling. "No," Dr. Reed whispered urgently, putting a hand on Silas's chest. "There are too many. If you start shooting from down here, they'll burn the house down with Hattie inside." "Wait!" Reed rushed up the stairs, closing the trap door and throwing a rug over it. Upstairs, the front door of the surgery had been kicked in. Sheriff Thorne stood there with 4 deputies, all with drawn guns. But behind them were 5 new men, strangers. They wore long dusters and low-brimmed hats. They carried Winchester repeaters and moved with the easy, deadly grace of professional killers. The regulators. "What is the meaning of this?" Dr. Reed demanded, standing in the hallway. "Harboring a fugitive," the sheriff spat. "Where is he?" "I haven't seen Kincaid since the whipping. I'm treating a patient." One of the regulators, a man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, pushed past the doctor. He walked into the patient room where Hattie lay. Hattie was sitting up, clutching the sheet to her chest. She was terrified, but her jaw was set. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Not again. Get up," the regulator said. His voice was flat, bored. "She can't move," Dr. Reed protested, rushing in. "Her stitches will tear." The regulator backhanded Dr. Reed without looking at him. The doctor crumpled to the floor, dazed. The man grabbed Hattie by her arm, right over the wound, and yanked. Hattie screamed. It was a sharp, jagged sound. Fresh blood bloomed on the back of her nightdress. "We're taking her to the jail," the regulator announced. "Public enemy, accomplice to arson." They dragged her out. Hattie stumbled, her legs weak, her bare feet dragging in the snow. The cold bit into her skin, but the pain in her back was all-consuming. "Silas!" She didn't mean to yell it, but it ripped out of her throat. "Don't come! Run!" They hauled her down the main street. Curtains twitched in windows. The townspeople watched, hidden and afraid. They saw Hattie Miller, the woman who had carried their flour and swept their floors, being dragged through the mud like a sack of grain. They threw her into the jail cell, not a room, but a cage of iron bars in the center of the sheriff's office. She collapsed on the dirty floor, shivering violently. Mayor Sterling walked in. He looked at her with pure contempt. "Comfortable, Hattie?" he sneered. "You're going to stay here until your mountain man comes knocking, and when he does, my new friends here will cut him to ribbons." He turned to the regulators. "Post men on the roof, men in the livery stable across the street. If a dog barks, shoot it." The trap was set. But Silas Kincaid was not a dog, and he was not a simple man with a gun. From the ventilation grate of the doctor's cellar, Silas had heard everything. He had heard Hattie scream. He had heard the blow that struck the doctor. He didn't burst out in a rage. The red mist that usually descended on men in battle didn't come to him. Instead, a glacial calm settled over his mind. He waited until the heavy boots faded. He waited until Dr. Reed groaned upstairs. Silas emerged from the cellar. He helped the doctor into a chair. "They took her," Reed wheezed, wiping blood from his lip. "They have 10 men, maybe 12. 5 are professionals." "I know," Silas said. He walked to the window and looked at the jailhouse down the street. It was lit up like a lantern, a beacon. "You can't attack the jail, Silas," Reed warned. "It's a fortress. It's suicide." Silas turned to the doctor. His face was a mask of death. "I'm not going to attack the jail," Silas said. "I'm going to turn the town against them." "How? People are terrified." "People are terrified because they are alone," Silas said. "But they saw what happened today. They saw a woman dragged through the snow. They just need a push." Silas went to the back of the surgery. He found a jar of kerosene and a heavy roll of cotton bandages. "Doctor," Silas said, "do you have any mining blasting caps from when you treated the gold prospectors?" Reed hesitated, then nodded. "In the safe." "Why?" "Because," Silas said, strapping his knife to his leg, "the mayor likes fire. I'm going to give him a fire he can't put out. But first, I need to visit the church." "The church? The Reverend is in Sterling's pocket. I'm not going for the Reverend," Silas said, pulling his fur hood up. "I'm going for the bell." That night, at 3 a.m., the silence of Fort Laramie was shattered. Dong! The church bell rang. It wasn't the rhythmic toll of Sunday service. It was a frantic, heavy clangor. Dong, dong, dong. Lights flickered on in houses. The regulators on the jailhouse roof spun around, aiming their rifles toward the church steeple at the far end of town. "What the hell is that?" Sheriff Thorne yelled, running out. "It's a diversion," the head regulator shouted. "Stay on the girl. Keep eyes on the girl." But then a second sound joined the bell. An explosion. Not at the jail. Not at the church. The mayor's private warehouse, located behind the general store, erupted in a fireball that turned the night into day. And then another explosion. The livery stable, where the mayor kept his prized carriage horses, blew its doors off. The horses had been let loose moments before. They stampeded down the main street, adding to the chaos. "He's destroying the town!" Bo Sterling screamed, running out of the saloon. But he was wrong. Silas wasn't destroying the town. He was destroying the Sterling holdings. And amidst the fire and the ringing bell, a voice boomed out. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the wooden buildings. "Fort Laramie!" Silas roared from the shadows of a roofline. "They took your daughter. They starve your children. Are you sheep, or are you free men?" The door to the general store opened. Old Man Miller, Hattie's father, stepped out. He held a double-barreled shotgun. He had always been a coward. But he had seen his daughter's blood in the snow. Then the blacksmith stepped out holding a heavy hammer. Then the baker. Then the drovers. Silas Kincaid had lit the match. But the town was the powder keg, and the mountain man was about to lead the charge. The street of Fort Laramie had become a war zone, illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the burning warehouse. The regulators, professional killers who were used to intimidating lone farmers, found themselves facing something they hadn't calculated, a tidal wave of resentment. Old Man Miller was the first to fire. His shotgun roared, taking out a hitching post near a deputy's leg. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was a declaration. The blacksmith, Gus, swung his hammer into the side of the livery stable, shattering the wood and forcing the snipers on the roof to scramble for cover. "Hold the line!" Sheriff Thorne screamed, ducking behind a water trough. "Shoot them! They're civilians!" "They're neighbors!" a deputy yelled back, throwing down his badge. "I ain't shooting Gus. I owe him for my horse." The town's rebellion was messy and chaotic, but it served Silas's purpose perfectly. It pulled the eyes of the enemy outward. While the regulators fired into the smoke, a massive shape crashed through the back wall of the sheriff's office. Silas hadn't used the door. He had used a heavy logging chain attached to 2 frightened dray horses to rip the iron bars of the rear window clean out of the frame, taking a chunk of the wall with them. He stepped into the office through the dust and debris. Bo Sterling was there, cowering in the corner. But standing between Silas and Hattie's cell was the head regulator, a man known in the territories as Frank Griggs. Griggs was fast, mean, and held a Winchester pointed straight at Hattie's head inside the cell. "Take another step, bear man," Griggs smiled, his teeth yellow in the gloom, "and the girl loses her face." Silas stopped. His chest was heaving. He was covered in soot, sweat, and blood. He looked at Hattie. She was slumped against the bars, pale and shivering, but her eyes were locked on him. "Don't," Hattie whispered. "Drop the rifle," Griggs commanded. "Kick it over." Silas slowly lowered the Sharp's buffalo gun. He set it on the floor. He kicked it toward Griggs. "Smart," Griggs sneered. "Now get on your knees. Bo, get his knife." Bo, seeing Silas unarmed, found his courage. He scrambled up, pulling a pearl-handled revolver. "I'll kill him. I'll do it myself." "Wait, you idiot," Griggs snapped, momentarily distracted by the mayor's son's incompetence. That split second was all Hattie needed. She was hurt. She was exhausted. But she was heavy, and she was close to the bars. Griggs was standing just inches from the cell door. Hattie lunged. She didn't grab him with her hands. She threw her entire body weight against the iron door of the cell. The heavy iron grate slammed outward on its hinges, which had been unlocked by Bo in his haste to taunt her earlier. The metal door collided with Griggs's shoulder with the force of a battering ram. Griggs stumbled sideways, his aim ruined. His rifle discharged into the ceiling. Silas moved. He didn't run. He exploded. He covered the 10 feet between them before Griggs could recover. Silas didn't punch. He tackled. He drove his shoulder into Griggs's chest, lifting the gunman off his feet and slamming him into the heavy oak desk. Bones snapped. Griggs dropped the rifle, gasping for air. But he pulled a knife from his boot. He slashed, cutting a deep line across Silas's forearm. Silas didn't even blink. He grabbed Griggs's wrist. There was a sickening crack as he twisted it. Silas silenced the regulator with a single, thunderous headbutt. Griggs slumped to the floor, unconscious. Silence fell in the room. Silas turned slowly to Bo Sterling. Bo was trembling, holding his revolver with both hands. The barrel was shaking so hard the sight was dancing all over the room. "Stay back!" Bo shrieked. "I am the mayor's son! I own this town!" "You own nothing," Silas said, stepping over the unconscious body of the gunman. "You built a castle on sand, and the tide just came in." "I'll shoot!" Bo squeezed his eyes shut and pulled the trigger. Click! Bo's eyes snapped open. He pulled again. Click! Silas stopped a foot away from him. He reached out and gently took the gun from Bo's limp fingers. He opened the cylinder. It was empty. Bo, in his panic and vanity, had never reloaded after firing at tin cans earlier that day. A man who relies on fear, Silas rumbled, forgets to check his iron. Silas grabbed Bo by the collar of his expensive suit. He didn't hit him. He didn't kill him. He dragged him to the front door of the jailhouse and kicked it open. Outside, the shooting had stopped. The regulators, seeing the tide turn, had fled into the night. The townspeople stood in a semicircle, holding torches and pitchforks. Mayor Sterling was being held by the blacksmith, his face pale as a sheet. Silas threw Bo down the stairs. The boy tumbled into the mud, landing at his father's feet. "Take them," Silas said to the town. "They're yours." He didn't wait for the cheers. He didn't wait for the justice that would surely come to the Sterlings. He turned back into the jailhouse. He went to the cell. Hattie was sitting on the floor, holding her side. She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over, cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "You came back," she sobbed. "You crazy fool, you came back." Silas knelt. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about the open door. He gathered her into his arms, burying his face in her neck. "I told you," he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't leave my shield behind." 6 months later. May, 1875. The air in the Bighorn Mountains was thin and sweet, smelling of pine sap and melting snow. A cabin sat near the timberline, sturdy and built of hand-hewn logs. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Hattie stood on the porch, looking out over the valley below. She was still a big woman. She always would be. But the heaviness of her spirit was gone. She wore a dress of soft buckskin, stitched with care, and her hair hung loose down her back. The scar on her shoulder still pulled when the weather turned cold, a jagged map of the night she saved a life. But she no longer hid it. It was a badge of honor. Silas came up the path from the creek, a string of trout in his hand. He stopped when he saw her. He dropped the fish on the chopping block and walked up the steps. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her head. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, painting the world in gold and violet. In Fort Laramie, they told stories about the mountain man and the girl who took the whip. They became a legend, a warning to tyrants, and a lullaby for the downtrodden. But up here, above the clouds, there were no legends. There was only the wind, the earth, and the quiet, unbreakable love of two people who had found their home in each other. "Cold?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble against her back. Hattie leaned back into him, feeling the solid, unshakable warmth of the man she had saved and who had saved her in return. "No," Hattie smiled, watching the first star appear. "I'm finally warm." And that is the legend of Silas and Hattie. In a world that told her she was too much and told him he was nothing but a savage, they found the only truth that matters. Loyalty is stronger than iron. and love is the only thing that can heal a scar. The Sterlings lost their fortune, and eventually the town of Fort Laramie forgot their names. But the story of the girl who took the whip, that story is still whispered in the Wyoming wind. What about you? If you were in that crowd, watching injustice happen, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have stepped in front of the whip? If this story moved you, if you believe that true strength comes from the heart and not the eyes, please hit that like button. It helps us share these lost legends with the world. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open. Thanks for watching.